You'll never be boring.
He's on fire! Boom shakalaka!
This year, Capcom released the Capcom Fighting TXN, which included another version of Street Fighter 2. There are some good games in this TXN, including Cyberbots, Super Zen Fighters, and for the first time since its original arcade release, Red Earth. However, the main reason I got this game was for the Darkstalkers games. In this video, I want to discuss about Capcom's glorious fighting game franchise, and what made it so beloved for over 25 years from die-hard Capcom fans, including myself, as well as introducing people to the series that wondered where the succubus from Marvel vs. Capcom came from. Welcome to the Undead world of Darkstalkers. I enjoy fighting games, but I would say I'm more of a casual fan than a straight up competitive player, so this is someone who is going in from a casual player's perspective. I knew about characters like Morden and Frieza through the Versus games, but my introduction to the series was, I believe, the 2000s on the PSP with Darkstalkers The Chaos Tower, a modified version of the third game but with all the playable characters from the series. It was a fun time, but the PSP was not a good pick for a 2D fighter due to its terrible analog stick. It was when I played Darkstalkers Resurrection back in 2013 where I fell in love with the series and its cast of characters, but what made Capcom's Undead fighter special. Before we get to the meat and potatoes of the video, I want to introduce a quick question for today's video. What games do you love playing during the Halloween season? I love the classic Castlevania games like Rondo of Blood and Bloodlines, as well as the Devil May Cry games, except for 2 of course. I enjoy a lot of platformers as well as fast-paced action games, and both of those tick at least one of those boxes, especially during the evening. I would love to hear your comments or your thoughts on the Darkstalkers series if you played it. Anyway, back to the video. During the 90s, Capcom struck gold with Street Fighter 2 that influenced the arcade scene and gave birth to many fighting games. With the success of Street Fighter 2, there were many updates including Super Street Fighter 2, The New Challenges, released in 1993 for Capcom's new CPS2 arcade board system. While it was the first game that used the CPS2 system, Darkstalkers The Night Warriors was the first original fighting game that used it, and was Capcom's next fighting game franchise to test what the arcade board can do for the genre. The original idea of making a 1v1 monster fighter is a bit hazy with different games. The art director Akira Yasuda, aka Akiman, claims that his colleague Tatsuya Akitomo came up with the idea of a monster fighting game. Game designer Yoshihito Okamoto, known for many older Capcom titles, also backs up Akiman's claim and even said that Akitomo went to San Diego Comic-Con one year for a business trip and discussed how Americans loved vampires and werewolves, saying how paying copyright fees was a pain and how it would be cool to make a game with a bunch of royalty-free characters. There were loads of horror movies, including the monster movies of genre during the 80s and early 90s, and titles like Dracula, Frankenstein and the Wolfman were already in the public subconscious ever since the film industry existed. Plus, the 1v1 fighter genre was in its boom, which made perfect sense from a business perspective. Another claim was that Alex Jimenez, a former Capcom consultant and producer of the US branch, who wanted to make a fighting game filled with Universal Studios monsters since he was a big fan of them, but then was rejected to make it filled with monster OCs. The game is about 2.5 decades old, and the development of the game is even younger, so the memories for the party involved are probably a bit murky. Art director Akiman and a bunch of developers were working on 2 projects, a side-scroller platformer and a game based on an unidentified manga, before they were ultimately cancelled and moved on to assisting the Darkstalkers developers. Each designer was tasked to come up with a character or characters for the game and give them a backstory and personality. The Western staff were the ones who came up with the names and gave flavor text to each fighter. Haru Murata, who came in late in development, was the one who was tasked to fit these characters and stories together while making sense in the game's world. There were tons of prototype designs for the first game's roster, all yet dramatically different to their final designs. Sasquatch's design went from a Cyclops with iron chains to the lovable Yeti design. Morden was originally meant to be a vampire like a male counterpart. There was this prototype of her inspired by Go Nagai's Devil Lady, who was extremely buff. That gave me that she might have been a grappler character similar to Zangief. She was then transitioned into a succubus due to Jimenez suggesting though her vampiric design can be heavily seen in her final design with the bat wings and patterns. Jimenez requested that Fiisa would be an African lady with lorgnettes that transforms into a Black Panther when she goes into a special cat, but was denied and instead became a Catwoman hybrid. I enjoyed some of these designs, yet Anakaris' design with the cobra behind him, as well as Ritaro's derpy mermaniac. Bendis, aka Duda Cheese, did the finalization for the characters and was the main illustrator of the game, which is beautiful. With everything planned and coded, Darkstalkers The Night Warriors, also known as Vampire The Night Warriors in Japan, was released upon the world in arcades in July 1994.
Get ready. Fight!
Not sure if it was intentional, but the subtitle, Night Warriors, is similar to Street Fighter 2's subtitle, The World Warrior, which might be a nod to its older brother, as well as hinting towards consumers that the same developers behind Darkstalkers were the same company who made the smash hit title. There are two realms, the human realm, aka Earth, and the demon realm, Makai, and the majority of our casts are from Makai. The overall plot is about Pyron, an alien who's trying to consume Earth, and it's up to one of the playable fighters to stop him, with their own reason why, like Dimitri, who attempts to rule both realms. The first game has a cast of 10 playable fighters, with 2 boss characters, Huitsu and Pyron, playable in the console re-releases. Dimitri is your Sota of the game like Ryu, but what makes him stand out from your main characters in other early fighting games is that he's kinda more aligned with the villain archetype, and is probably the first ever of his kind in the genre, even beating Tekken's Kazuya Misama by a couple of months. In fact, the cast stand out from a bunch of early 90s fighting games, ditching the usual martial artists and street thugs in favour of vampires, werewolves, mummies and aliens. We have the popular Morgan, Fiisa, a cat girl, Anakaris, a mummy, John Talbane, a werewolf that knows Kung Fu, Bisamon, a cursed samurai ghost, Ritaro, a merman inspired by the creature of the Black Lagoon, Lord Raptor, who is identical to the Iron Maiden mascot, Victor the Frankenstein monster, and Sasquatch the lovable Yeti. The 2 boss characters are Huitsu, a robot who is ordered to end all life on Earth, and Pyron, Capcom's version of the Axis. Like its older sibling, you go through the arcade ladder defeating every character, and once you defeat Pyron, you get a character specific ending. The story does have some dark, sad moments, like in Victor's ending, who wishes to be the strongest to make his creator proud, as he feels he is being ignored. Unfortunately, he doesn't understand the concept of death, and doesn't realise that his creator was already dead from the beginning. Some character endings are more upbeat, like Fiisa's ending, where he becomes a celebrity sporting movie deals and winks in front of the camera. Darkstalkers has the 3 punch and kick buttons layout like its predecessor. Using the CPS2 model, Darkstalkers to do a lot to innovate the genre, such as the ability to dash, air dash and air block. Victor is the only one who cannot dash, and with a lot of projectiles too, he has a tough time with some opponents like Morgan. Fighters can guard cancel using a special move while blocking. While Street Fighter 2 had combos, it was originally considered a glitch, and even then the combos were limited and strict. Darkstalkers introduced chain combos as a feature, allowing the player to cancel one move to another and is less strict with timing, just like how modern fighters handle them. It feels so much better to control compared to SF2. Each fighter has a super meter that allows the player to do 2 things: perform an EX move, which is a stronger version of your special attack, or an ES move, where you can perform a special combo. However, the special meter will repeat over time, as if the devs want the person to be on the offensive and use it immediately. It makes for some dead mind games between the combatants. There are 3 settings for how fast the game can be, with 1 being the lowest and 3 being the highest. When I play this game, I go with the highest setting as it feels so good to play, but if you want, you can make the game a bit slower if you want fast on the triggers. I think if you're playing this online on the Capcom, it only runs on the highest setting. The original game was a game changer, however it quickly became overshadowed with the sequel Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge, released in 1995 in the arcades.
Get ready. Fight!
In Japan, the sequel was known as Vampire Hunter Darkstalkers Revenge, which is a fitting title as it introduces 2 new characters, being Donovan Bane and Sienko, 2 dark hunters that tend to slay the Darkstalkers. Donovan is a half-vampire that attempts to control his vampiric part from taking control. He is accompanied by a young girl named Anita, or as the arcade ending calls her, Amanda, a sidekick that lost her family by Darkstalkers and became emotionless. Donovan took care of the girl and hoped that one day Anita would be able to feel again. He is considered the main character in the second installment, although despite being the main protagonist, he doesn't return in the arcade version of the third game, as in his ending he gets consumed by his vampiric half, sacrificing himself, which makes Anita able to feel again. His ending cuts to the future as Anita wonders what happened to him, and then we see him on a throne in a dark room, surrounded by drained dead corpses, still attempting to fight his vampiric side. This story does continue in a what-if scenario in the Japanese-only Darkstalkers TXN on the PlayStation 2, where Donovan fully succumbs to his vampiric side and becomes D, where he fights an adult Anita and supposedly uses the fight. It's a tragic ending which made me like them 2 a lot, and Donovan is fun to play as with the power to control the elements and even to ride on a sword. No, he isn't my favourite out the newcomers. That has to go to Sienko, a Shanxi, which are Chinese vampires or zombies. Sienko and her sister Mei-yin are siblings in one body after an experiment to attempt to resurrect their mother, who was killed by a Darkstalker. Sienko is the body while Mei-yin is the talisman. In their ending, they defeat the Darkstalkers but die at the end. Before disappearing into the void, their mother soars up from the afterlife and is grateful to what they had accomplished, and reincarnates them as twins as a reward. It's more of a sweet ending compared to Donovan's. Sienko is also my favourite character to play as, able to use various weapons, teleport, run in midair, and is able to throw random items. Her heavy version of throw weapons is thrown very high and has a bit of a DA coming down, so it's funny to see them yan on opponents. My other favourites in the 2 games are John Calbane and Sasquatch, who are incredibly speedy. Besides the additions of the new characters, the boss characters also became playable for the first time in the arcade version. Night Warriors refined some of the original mechanics while adding more that added a pursuit attack when an opponent is lying on the floor, and a wake up slide which allows the person on the floor to move left or right to evade incoming attacks, adding more to the mind games. The timed special meter is now replaced with a special meter that can be stacked up to 3 times and can be carried between rounds, so the player can plan to perform the special moves or can use one after the other. Instead of 3 times of speed this time, you can select between either normal or turbo, with turbo being my choice. The game also has a feature for beginners too, which is the auto guard feature, which can be selected on the character select screen. The auto guard allows the player to have 10 auto blocks per match if the player doesn't add any inputs. Both games are great, but the second game does everything the original does, but better. It took 2 years till we got the 3rd installment, Vampire Savior, Lord of the Vampire, which was released in arcades in 1997. While the game reuses sprites for the veterans, Vampire Savior is a brand new game that changes some previous features from the past titles and adds new stuff. Donovan, Hewitzer, and Pyron are replaced with 4 newcomers, QB, BB Hood, Lilith, and the main antagonist of the game, Jeddah, who I feel fits the turn of the series better compared to Pyron, as he has more connections with the Makai realm. Zeta was once one of the leaders of the Makai realm after dying prematurely. After being resurrected, he believes that the state of the realm to be in shambles, so he decides to save the souls by absorbing them into a single entity in his new dimension named the Magician. The game has an arcade ladder, but instead of fighting against 12 fighters in a row like the previous titles, it's only 7, and in some editions you don't even fight Zeta as the final opponent. There was this one time I was playing Yirth, and I never encountered him, and instead my final opponent was Morden. In canon, Yirth is a part of Morden. When Morden was an infant, her father worried that she was too powerful for her to control, so he decided to divide her soul into 3, one of them being Yirth. In both Yirth's and Morden's endings, they merged into one. One of my favourite endings is BB-Hood's, which is drawn differently compared to the rest of the cast, with a cartoonishly grim fairy tale style, distorting a family of werewolves, portraying her as a serial killer. BB-Hood is similar to Donovan and Ciento being a hunter, but unlike them two, she is fully human and a sadistic one at that, who does it for profit and pleasure. It's one of the more comedic elements of the series. The gameplay of Vampire Savior is treated differently. Instead of the round system like before, this game introduces the impact damage system, where each fighter will have 2 health bars. Once you use 1 health bar, the match will immediately continue without transitioning to another round, and the opposing player would still have their remaining health left. This makes the game stand out a bit more compared to other Capcom fighters at the time, as well as making each fight quick and snappy, not disturbing the flow of the game. If you are familiar with any Killer Instinct game, it's similar to how that series handles it. The character can also regain some of their health back, indicated by the white bar, if they are able to avoid taking any damage. This is a great addition as it forces the offender to be more offensive, while the person who has taken damage has to be more defensive and fight back in order to claim their lost health. There were times where I won matches because I regained a good portion of my health by making sure the opponent doesn't hit me again. The player can also store up to 99 super meter bars. You won't be able to get that in a high singular match, but it's there if you want it. Alongside the EX and ES moves returning, this title introduces the Dark Force mechanic, which gives unique abilities to each fighter for a limited time, such as giving Zeta the ability to fly, or allowing BB-Hood to fire missiles when she does a radio attack. Some fighters can even access 2 Dark Force abilities in a match, such as Sasquatch, who can either use super armor or have a bunch of explosive penguins. Along with guard cancel, players can now push block, able to push away opponents while blocking. No, I wouldn't say I'm the best at it. Anakaris is the only character who cannot push block, so that makes him the worst character. In the same year, Japan got 2 extra versions of Vampire Savior, that being Vampire Hunter 2, which swaps the newcomers with the characters missing from the previous games, but keeps the mechanics of Savior and Vampire Savior 2, which brings back the newcomers as well as Donovan, Huitzel and Pyron, but removes John Talbane, Sasquatch and Rikaro. All the character endings were removed too. Japanese excuses were added to the Capcom fighting collection this year, so if you want to give them a try, that's a viable option. Apparently there are some technical gameplay differences between these games, but when I played them I didn't really notice much. When Vampire Savior was ported to the PlayStation 1, it was released as Darkstalkers 3, having all the characters from all versions. I haven't played the PS1 port, but from what I know there were some issues, such as cut animation frames, which made the gameplay feel rough. The second version is meant to be the superior version at the time, since it didn't have those issues, but that was a Japan exclusive. Yet many Capcom arcade titles, Vampire Savior also has some cool secrets too, like pirate swap couches and others. While you can easily get them up now, it was cool to discover hidden content back in the day, which isn't something you can get now with DLC content. The original Vampire Savior is so much fun, being one of my favourite fighting game titles. The series is incredibly fast paced, with matches being quick as well as being easier to get into compared to Street Fighter's Footsie's gameplay. It rewards the rushdown style gameplay that is my cup of tea, while being incredibly in depth in its mechanics. The series has some creative fighters that feel different compared to SF2, with their unique playstyle. The only ones I would say feel familiar are Dimitri, Morden and Yirth. being more Soto fighters, and even then 3 of them aren't just copy and paste, but bring new stuff that they can call on their own, with Dimitri's back cradle allowing him to teleport and dive kick the opponent, as well as being able to transform into a demonic form for his supers. Morden can change the trajectory once he dashes using a jetpack, and both Yith and Morden can change their wings into different forms. Darkstalkers has so much personality, with the majority of the cast being monsters combined with a more powerful engine. The designers, artists and animators can come up with some imaginative movesets, as well as make these characters more expressive. Despite being a horror monster fighting game with dark material, it has a lot of comedic moments. The animators were inspired by the likes of Tom and Jerry, Hanna-Barbera and classic Disney, with the characters having that rubber hose style of animation, as we see characters having their arms stretched out, inflate, or even morph into different objects when doing certain attacks. Victor has his brain pop out like a paddable when he gets knocked out. Lord Raptor has heart-shaped eyes come out when he sees Sienko, just like a Kate's Every cartoon, and each character transforms into tiny baby versions of themselves when hit by one of Anatar's attacks. One of the most famous moves in the series is Dimitri's Midnight Abyss, which was introduced in Vampire Savior, where he transforms every male character into a girl and the female characters into either sexy or weird versions of themselves before sucking their blood dry. They had to make new sprites for every character, and even in the first installment, there was a lot of love and care put into the animations and sprite work, which still holds up to this day. To be fair, seeing modern sprite in some crossovers does feel out of place. The backgrounds for each stage are incredibly detailed too, especially in the third game, where we can see some of the more horror elements shine. The boss stage with a giant fetus baby is both memorable and disturbing. After the 2 Japanese arcade games, there were no sequels, and its legacy remained in various compilations. Nowadays, the series are accessible either through Fightcade, which has a small yet dedicated scene, or by official means through the Darkstalkers Resurrection compilation on PS3 and Xbox Live, Capcom Arcade Stadium 2, and Capcom Fighting TXN, with the latter 2 on all modern platforms and Steam. There were plans on making a brand new game during the hype of Resurrection, but unfortunately that never came to be due to Capcom's extremely high expectations, despite the TXN doing pretty well. I would personally love Capcom to do a brand new game in the series. These games are widely available now, so any game is fine to play, but I highly recommend Night Warriors and the original version of Vampire Savior. Despite not getting a new installment, the legacy of the series can still be seen with a lot of its mechanics being used in various fighting games like Guilty Gear and later Street Fighter games. This franchise tends to be one of those where the characters are more recognizable than the actual games themselves, due to their strong designs as well as many of the cast members appearing in crossovers, especially Morden, who has a lot in common with Nintendo's Captain Falcon. Both series that I would have loved to make a return. The series has the look and the action gameplay to back it up. If you love fighting games with in-depth mechanics, give this series a try. I hope you enjoyed this video, and happy Halloween.